The threat from British jihadis is real, the Prime Minister told Parliament this afternoon, and in so doing he announced police would have temporary powers to exclude British nationals from returning to the UK. Sounds bold, but what that means is currently and crucially pretty unclear. The government has not specified whether they'd remove passports or remove citizenship from suspected terrorists, but both measures were tonight labelled probably impossible by the former Attorney-General. Allegra Stratton looks at the entire package announced today and what it really means.
Ed Miliband today called it a summer of international instability. August was the serious, not silly season. Such a steady stream of bad events, MPs told me they were convinced Parliament would be recalled. But it wasn't, leaving it all for Parliament today.
Good afternoon, sir.
The Prime Minister came to the House with a long list of crises to address. But it was the counter-terrorism announcements people were waiting for. In the early days of the coalition, Liberal Democrats and Conservatives forged common cause in protecting civil liberties. Since then, they have drifted apart. And over the weekend, Liberal Democrats voiced concerns that David Cameron today might go too far. Even one Conservative cabinet minister was concerned the Prime Minister might be too draconian.
To confront the threat of Islamist extremism, we need a tough, intelligent, patient and comprehensive approach to defeat the terrorist threat at its source.
He started with the areas of agreement. Legislation to give the border police temporary powers to take passports away from UK citizens planning to leave to fight jihad. Airlines will also be required by law to cooperate with the intelligence agencies on who's flying where. But everything else was harder. On plans to exclude suspected British terrorists from returning to the UK, David Cameron was only able to say he would work up proposals and put them to cross-party talks. And indeed, in another area, there was something of a U-turn. The coalition shelved the Labour Party's control orders when they came to power. Today, to raucous laughter by the opposition, the coalition had to agree they would be looking at bringing back control orders, in all but name.
So we will introduce new powers to add to our existing terrorism prevention and investigation measures, including stronger locational constraints on suspects under T-pins, either through enhanced use of exclusion zones or through relocation powers.
David Cameron's position on civil liberties has changed somewhat over the years. When he became leader, it was against Tony Blair and his tough law and order government. David Cameron sensed an opening, and it was the Tories that pledged to protect civil liberties in this country. Even though, as a young man, he worked for Michael Howard's Home Office, hardly noted for its lenient law and order agenda. When David Cameron became leader of the Conservatives, it was he that pledged to protect civil liberties, part of an agenda to woo over metropolitan liberal Britain. That agenda has now been seriously downplayed. This is the then leader of the opposition in 2009. So here is the next stage in our radical redistribution of power, stopping the state from exerting too much power over us by enhancing personal freedom. So you will not be followed or have your home entered for no good reason. You will be tried by your peers, protected from unjust prosecution abroad, and your identity will be freed from the chains of state databases.
Now today, I want to focus my remarks on terrorism.
This speech at Munich in 2011 was a turning point. Less than 1 year of being in office had hardened David Cameron. Here he said multiculturalism had failed and Islamism was a bigger threat than people thought. From this time, the coalition partners started to go their separate ways on civil liberties.
When a white person holds objectionable views, racist views for instance, we rightly condemn them. But when equally unacceptable views or practices come from someone who isn't white, we've been too cautious, frankly even fearful, to stand up to them.
Tonight it's unclear what elements of the Prime Minister's package, apart from passport seizures and airline cooperation, will see the light of day. David Cameron was beaten back by Lib Dem opposition and legal concerns. Not a great first day back at Parliament.
That was Allegra Stratton, and joining me now, the one-time control order detainee Kerry Bullivant and the former independent reviewer of terror legislation, Lord Carlisle, and we'll come to Lord Carlisle in a second. But Kerry, first to you, how did the control order affect you? You had it for about a year and a half.
As in my case, as in many others, the control order debilitates your life, and that's the purpose of it. It left me with severe depression, and it pushed me into a corner where I felt my only option was to abscond and go on the run for 5 weeks.
So how easy was it then to evade it?
this is the problem with all of these measures. If you have dangerous people, you don't want them being held in the community. They needs to be put in prison, and the only way you can do that is through criminal charges. Evading these things was relatively easy, and none of the people that have ever absconded either from control orders or TPIMs have been caught.
So actually, the relocation measure that's been put in would stop people like you re-entering their own community, right? I mean, that's exactly what it's designed to do.
I could have absconded whether I was on a relocation order or not. That would have had very little effect on whether I did abscond. The fact of the matter is that the relocation, even according to Lord MacDonald, was disproportionate and unjustified. He said in his report on control orders that it was inimical to British values and norms. So while the Conservative government are telling Muslims that they need to embrace British values, they themselves are abandoning them with this internal exile.
Could you have left the country? They took your passport, didn't they?
I didn't leave the country, but the two people that I absconded with did leave the country.
With what? With fake passports?
I wasn't with them when they did that. I had handed myself in.
But you absconded and then you handed yourself back in, so in a sense
Yeah.
you're proving that they do work, right?
Well, no, because the only person who's ever faced justice for this was myself, and I handed myself in. I chose to come back in. Everybody else has not been caught and has not been brought to justice on this. So the fact of the matter is you have a measure that doesn't protect the British public, that captures innocent people like myself. I had my life ruined for 2 years and continues until today on the basis of secret courts and secret evidence. How is this British value?
The idea is to stop jihadis from coming back into Britain. Can you see how these new measures today will be a deterrent?
These aren't even new measures that were brought in today. Since April 2014, Theresa May has been using the royal prerogative to take away people's passports. So what we see today is grandstanding, the rehashing of old policies put out as new so that the government can be seen to be tough on terrorism, when in actual fact all it's going to do is create more of a ghettoisation and disenfranchisement within the Muslim community, because these measures aren't used for Ukrainian separatists.
Kerry, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Lord Carlisle, I know you don't want to interact particularly, but you've heard those arguments and they're pretty powerful when you hear somebody who's had a control order saying more disenfranchised and that the whole idea is inimical to British values. That must strike a chord, doesn't it?
I think the arguments that we've just heard are misleading. Relocation orders worked very well. For the last 5 years of control orders, relocation orders were entirely ineffective. They were properly policed. They came before the courts. The courts heard all the evidence. Some people had their relocation orders varied by a judge. It was found to be fair. It was found to be proportionate. There was never a finding that control orders were contrary to the Human Rights Act, and to represent so is wrong.
But you make it sound like there's a legal structure around this. There isn't a trial. There isn't a charge.
No, there is a legal structure. There's a very complex legal structure around TPIMs and around relocation orders under the old control orders regime. Every one of these cases automatically went before a very senior judge, a High Court judge. Not only was the individual represented by his own lawyers, but special advocates were put in to represent the position of the individual when secret intelligence was being heard in court. It could not have been a fairer procedure.
And yet you've heard the testimony there of somebody who says, A, they absconded, B, the
Not
two
from
people
relocation, no.
Well, he said it didn't matter where he would have been, he could have absconded.
No, well, that's just not true. I'm telling you what the facts. There were not absconds from relocation. As independent reviewer as I was at that time, I went to visit people who'd been relocated. The system worked well and it was found to be fair and proportionate.
What about the two that he was with who left the country?
Well, they've got nothing to do with relocation. They were people who were the subject to control orders without relocation.
But we're trying to test whether this is actually an effective system. And if you've got somebody who, OK, without relocation, if you insist, still absconded, two others who left the country, and an overall impression that they have been maltreated by a British system who hasn't actually...
I don't think the British public believe they were maltreated at all. And, you know, as I repeat, this system, which involved relocation, was upheld by the courts repeatedly.
I want to talk about this idea of taking somebody's passport on their way in. How workable is that? You heard what Dominic Grieve said this afternoon. probably impossible for government to prevent Britain's returning.
I agree entirely with Dominic Grieve and with Sir Mingus Campbell, who said the same the day before yesterday. If somebody is a British citizen and has no other nationality, then it is unlawful under international law to remove their passport from them until they're within the country. Once they re-enter the country, it may well be lawful.
So how practically then do you stop would-be jihadis re-entering Britain?
Well, if they're British citizens and they have no other nationality, you can't.
Right.
What you should do is arrest them if there is evidence that they've committed criminal offences, or if we reintroduce something like relocation, TPIMs beefed up, then that is an option that can be used against
Before
them.
they've left?
Before they've left or when they return. What we cannot do under international law, and it would be asking for trouble if we tried to do it, is prevent British citizens who have no other nationality from re-entering their own country.
Doesn't it strike you then that there is a gap in the rhetoric tonight between what David Cameron has said he's doing and what he is legally able to produce?
What he said was entirely truthful. He said, and I summarise, that they were going to try and find an all-party approach to this question of jihadis re-entering the country. I think it's certain that the all-party approach they will find will correspond with what Dominic Grieve said, and indeed I think the government should now tell us at least the gist of the advice that they were given by the current law officers, Jeremy Wright and Robert Buckland. I wouldn't mind betting that the advice they gave was entirely consistent with Dominic Grieve's view.
Look, well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Pro-democracy campaigners in Hong Kong have vowed to fight